I wanted to ask you if you could talk about. I have a house in 29 Palms,
Oh,
coincidentally, yeah.
Yeah.
And I bought it 15 years ago as a gesture of like my life sort of fell apart, and I felt like some reason I'd been going there for years, and so it was the obvious choice to me because I felt well there. But I wanted you to explain sort of what I wanted to know where that sign is, by the way. But I wanted to know how you view like what's happening there with the whole Palm Springs Renaissance, Palm Springs and the moneyed sort of stuff happening, and even Desert Hot Springs, which was like meth head world forever, and now it's like spa, Ace Hotel. Like, how does it work for the people? Like 29 Palms has a general plan, and they keep everybody out. And I'm talking about 29, but it could be any of these places. And in their interest in trying to preserve their communities, their towns are dying because there's no new life coming in, so all of the desert rats kind of take over. I just wanted to know sort of what you think about all that stuff.
It sounds like you know exactly how complicated these places are. Several things are occurring. Thank you for your question. 29 Palms is defined by its neighbor is the Marine base. The Marine Corps Air and Ground Combat Center is the biggest employer for the entire Morongo Basin. There's a lot of Marine families that live in 29 Palms. My neighbors, when I lived in 29 Palms, were Marine. And of course, that Marine base, it's the largest training facility for the Marines in the United States. And because our wars of the last generation have been in the desert, that has been the training facility of choice.
Right.
So a lot of young men and women have gone through 29 Palms to train. So it's defined by the military in so many ways. It's such a fraught place. The phantasmagorical desert and the sublime desert meet in a fault line right there. Because the highway north is the Marine base. The highway south is Joshua Tree National Park.
But I want to know what you think about, I mean, I read something a few years ago, like maybe 2 years ago, there was this article in LA, some of my family lives in LA, we're all from the East Coast originally, all from New York, and it says like, hot is the new cool.
Yes.
And it was telling everybody to,
Yeah.
go out, saddle up and buy stuff in Coachella and Indio and go live out there, and it's like kind of, Palm Springs was this thing, and now there's all these, and I want to know how you see extreme poverty and dysfunction versus this like incredible opulence and wealth and kind of new money.
Yeah.
Like, I just wondered what you think. Like, what happens when do they ever meet up? And
the short answer is they do and they don't. I mean, I know the article that you're talking about. The Los Angeles Times had a spread called New Desert Bohemia. They were writing about me and Elia, the friends that I was telling you at the very beginning. We were the unwitting. We had no idea. All we knew when we arrived in the desert is that it was cheap. And we were creative types who were fleeing gentrification in the city. And we wind up in the desert. Because of all the ways we've imagined the desert also. And the boom years are starting to pick up, and capital is looking for places to go. And capital is following buzz. And buzz is created by what? The gentrification model, the classic, I don't need to tell you all in San Francisco, gentrification wars. It follows artists. It follows artistic representation. And I think I mentioned a little bit ago the unholy alliance between artistic representation and real estate speculation. The effect of this is to distort, obscure, in a violent way, native populations who have been there for a long time, and ultimately displace them. So it's a representational displacement, and it's a physical, literal displacement. Ultimately, my crew, we were low rent, but after we arrived, the real money poured in. Andrew Zattel.
Yeah.
Andrew Zattel is Art America level, artist. And when she arrived, then Joni Mitchell was looking for a place, and Ann Magnuson and Bob Dylan's people were out scouting. I mean, it was a tornado, a whirlwind of speculation. driving up the people who are renting, driving up their rents, and tempting the old families to sell and just cash in. So it was incredibly destabilizing force. There's a lot of arguments on different sides to be made here. You yourself just said, well, if a town resists that kind of change, isn't it just like killing itself? Isn't it just going to die off?
Well,
there's another chapter here, set in Marfa, Texas. It was a dying town. The population was decreasing. Donald Judd arrived and saved it. But it also created a tremendously powerful schism in terms of race and class. So it wasn't ultimately a solution, I would argue. But thank you for your question.
Would envision northern New Mexico if it wasn't so much based on outsider revenue buying kitsch art depicting natives as buffalo hunters. Let's say the revenue was from a nuclear bomb factory in northern New Mexico.
Like Los Alamos.
Instead of tourism. What would it be like in your vision?
Well, Los Alamos National Labs are right there. So we have that actually on that landscape already, and it's the biggest employer in that area, besides Walmart, is Los Alamos National Labs. So, and we have uranium mining further up north on Navajo lands, native lands. So native lands and Hispano lands that have been in Hispano families for 12 generations in some cases are compromised by all these factors on the landscape, beginning with the real estate speculation of the Santa Fe ring and the dismantling of the old land grants, the marginalization of the native pueblos. The casino economy has changed the economic character of some of the native populations in the area in recent years. But we also hear stories about the social costs of what the casino economy does to local populations. There is more and more talk about legacy tourism or postmodern tourism, tourism with a conscience, historical tourism, where all the efforts of the fantastic wave of new Western, capital N, capital W, historians, writers, and artists. We have a whole generation now of new Western revision of these images. Angela and I visited with one of our old friends in northern New Mexico, and he actually said something that gave me a vision of northern New Mexico, which was totally turned the future on its head for us. We asked him, so how are the Pueblos doing? He said, they're doing pretty good. He's an Hispano guy, but he's got relationships with everybody. He said, they're doing pretty good. You know what I think? He said, I think the Pueblos are going to run this place in the future. I think the future, the Southwest, he said, is native run. That they're going to be ultimately the motor of the promotion of culture and history. I don't know if that's the case, but it was a stirring vision, to have to represent this place, from the native point of view, would turn the Western upside down. It wouldn't be called the Western anymore. We'd have to come up with a different name for it, just like San Juan Pueblo, when we were there, changed its name to Okeowinge in the native language. So history in the Southwest is lived, it's in our bodies, it's now, and there is, I don't want to leave you with a completely dark impression. I realize that the excerpt that I read is very, very dark, and I have qualms sometimes about reading it, but ultimately what I'm trying to do is trying to present a situation in which finally we can gaze upon the other intimately and ask ourselves, well, is this just the way it's going to be, or are we going to change it? Do we accept the one in the 99, or do we challenge it? Oakland. Long fist.
What do you think? So, what do you think are the reasons that drive people to drug addiction? Is it boredom? And what are the mechanisms with which that heroin, say, is bought in activity? And what is the intersection between crystal meth and heroin? And are those the only two drugs that are used as OxyContin and so forth, and what dynamics do you think drive that other than, say, unemployment or boredom or frustration, in your opinion and experience?
Thanks. I'm sure the way you asked the question, I'm sure you have plenty of ideas yourself. I should refer the question to the doctor of medical anthropology in the audience, my wife Angela Garcia, who wrote an entire book on it, and I do highly recommend her book, The Pastoral Clinic, Addiction and Dispossession Along the Rio Grande, which was published before my book. She beat me to it. And but what's if you look on Amazon right now, if you look at you look up this book, you know how they say, if you like this book, you might like this other book. We're a couple. We're a couple even on Amazon. So the books are together. So I recommend it. So I'll borrow from Angela's work. She situates heroin addiction in that area in particular in a historical context. Vietnam veterans coming back with addiction and sowing the seeds in a place in a space of dispossession. I was able to interview people in northern New Mexico, Hispanos, who grew up without electricity, but didn't grow up poor. They grew up on a land-based subsistence economy. It was a tough life, it was a hard life, but it was clean in every sense of the word. I think spiritually and physically. There are still some vestiges of that life. But by the late 60s and 70s, grazing allotments have been cut back. The land grants have been dismantled by real estate speculation. Oftentimes, people within the grant itself, selling out, to outside bidders. So the dismantling of the old rural economy, drugs coming in, and the coup de grace, as drug markets exploded in the United States, which coincides with the war on drugs, which tells us how great the war on drugs has been, right? The more we wage the war, the greater the problem of drugs. The more we militarize it, the greater the rate of addiction, the more drugs cross the border. Javier Cecilia, the Mexican poet and leader of the peace movement in Mexico, is on a caravan right now across the United States pointing this out to us. The coup de grace is that northern New Mexico is on what used to be, you'll still see the signs for it, the tourist signs that point out it was the Camino Real during the colonial days. From Mexico City, going north, the trade route, all the way up, right? And it ended in Española. That was the historic trade route. Well, that trade route today is from the poppy fields of Chihuahua to heroin addiction in northern New Mexico. It's a cocktail. All these different things, you put them all together, it's a cocktail in which, of course, there's going to be addiction there. Ultimately, Angela also argues psychological depression accompanying all this dispossession and losing what your forebears had, and well, what identity do you have left if you don't have the land itself? And that's ultimately, I think, one of the most painful ironies is for the native populations in this area to look at their landscape represented by outsiders. And by the way, I'm not claiming indigenous status here. I'm also an outsider. I'm trying to perform a critique on the outside gaze, but ultimately I'm an outsider too. And I know there's going to be a lot of norteños who are going to say, yeah, Ruben Martinez, he came here for a couple of years, and look, he thinks he's an expert on us. He's representing us. Another outsider. That whole outsider-native dialectic says everything about the history of conquest and dispossession itself. And briefly, other drugs, there's more and more prescription drug abuse and overdose. It's an epidemic. Meth is in the area, mostly on the Native American reservations, and cocaine. So it's generalized. It's a complicated. You know the wildfires that are raging right now throughout the Southwest, historic wildfires. The same thing is happening in terms of drugs.
go into how you got clean and sober in the book? Is that just a separate topic?
I was just answering a question about this from a journalist. The book tries to be part memoir, part reportage, or is it reportage? I've never known. I always use reportage because French is fancy. Part reportage, part memoir, part criticism. And in trying to balance those three, my editor, Reba Hockerman at Metropolitan Books, she pushed me to cut back on the memoir more and more. Sometimes I resisted. Sometimes I went to the mat on a couple of things that I kept in the book that she really wanted to cut. The drug narrative is very circumspect, but it's a through line through the book. By the end of the book, I don't say that I'm clean. According to AA, today I'm not clean and sober. I mean, I have occasional glass of wine and I smoke marijuana, but I'm not abusing cocaine right now, and that was the issue that ultimately led me to the desert, I think. So that particular personal process is alluded to, but it's not prescriptive. You know what I'm saying? I'm not using it as it's not a million little pieces. And I tell the truth here.
This is just kind of a random question, but are you still trying to research this topic, or are you done with this and putting this to rest, or what are you doing next?
Thanks. No, the desert is immense and eternal, and I'm totally hooked. In the book, I talk about how, my grandparents, my Mexican grandparents came from desert lands. My childhood, we went through the desert a lot. I came back to it as an adult. I was weaned on the Western, capital W, Western music. The soundtrack of my childhood was Marty Robbins and Freddie Fender. I'm a Western kid, capital W, and totally being aware of how I'm kind of like Tonto, saying that to the Lone Ranger. By the way, we just ran into Johnny Depp shooting the Lone Ranger and Tonto in northern New Mexico. I don't know. I assume he signed on to a new Western representation of the Lone Ranger and Tonto, and it's a revision somehow. We'll see. We'll track him on that. So yeah, I'm a total desert rat. I just went camping out in the Mojave National Preserve about a month ago by myself. I don't do that very often because when the sun sets and I'm out there by myself, I go crazy paranoid, man. It's scary as hell out there. I mean, the early Christian monastics, like the 4th century desert monastics, the early Christian mystics, they would write, like St. Anthony, they would write these narratives about how they would go out into their they called them cells, these little caves by themselves, and they would seal themselves in, and they said these horrible demons would assault them, and creatures with 10 heads, and these crazy phantasmagorical visions. And I've struck up a very close friendship with a theologian at Loyola Marymount, where I teach, Doug Chrisley, whose expertise is on the 4th century. And I asked him, when I came back from this trip, I said, I was so paranoid that, just like some, chupacabras or mountain lion or zombie was going to come out from behind a boulder and just, bash my head in with a rock. Is that the same thing that the Christian mystics were feeling? Is it like hardwired in us somehow? He said, totally. He said, like that paranoia is both contact with radical otherness for a city boy on the one hand, but it's also something that's embedded, kind of like when you're out in the wilderness, that's hardwired in us. Because there's plenty of things out there. There are snakes out there, and I don't like snakes. So, but then, of course, I settled in for the night and calmed down, did my little centering prayer thing. And ultimately, when the sky cleared a little bit, there had been a little bit of cloud cover, the stars came out. I mean, this is on the road to Death Valley, which is the starriest sky on the mainland. Okay? And when those stars came out, I just looked up into that, I saw God's face, and I went into a very peaceful sleep. And that's, that's the desert too. So, yeah, I'm going to be going. Que me entierren en el desierto. May they bury me out there.
Other questions?
Samuel.
Hey, this was excellent conversation. Just hearing you talk and hearing you read and having a chance to look at your book briefly, I'm of course interested in the linguistic representation of the desert and in the way that you write and think about language and the multiple varieties that I'm seeing in your performance as well as in the text, and what are you doing with that? Or how are you choosing to represent that? What kind of thought do you give to that? I mean, when we ordinarily think about the West, we might have one particular representation, but you seem to be weaving so much in here, and I wonder what kind of thought you're giving to that.
Sure. I mean, what I just the language I just gave to my description, kind of veering in and out of lyrical, romantic, sublime, capital R, Wordsworthian, I mean, at a certain, the early part of the writing was very organic, just pouring the words on the page, journals, interviews, the early part of the process. But once I knew the material that I had, I became conscious of the three elements: the memoir, reportage, and criticism, and then of just ultimately that I wanted to keep the reader moving back and forth across borders discursively, and all the tools that we have as writers in terms of conjuring imagery and playing off of type, stereotype, archetype. And I wanted the reader to never settle in too much into one particular point of view, because the West is just a kaleidoscope, which can be a sublime one or a violent one, oftentimes simultaneously. And so just keep mixing it up. And I forced myself as a writer to try to occupy the point of view of the other as often as I possibly could. Radical environmentalists, New Age mystics, and then the people that I have more sympathy with, ultimately, and to juxtapose those and to create tension between those representations. And also thinking a lot about how to render landscape and how to render the human form upon the landscape. Because I was always thinking about the painters, those early painters of the colonies, the art colonies, and the way the Western represents people on the landscape. John Ford, and more recently people like Paul Thomas Anderson. There Will Be Blood, which I think is probably the best Western of our generation. And early on, just in purely literary terms, I set myself the goal of writing against Cormac McCarthy. Because I just think he's a reactionary old fart. And I think his prose is purple and totally overwrought. And everybody goes, he's the Faulkner of the borderlands. Come on, give me a break. But ultimately, I realized, well, he is the Faulkner of the borderlands. He's incredibly powerful. I mean, those representations are to be dealt with. I mean, I was tilting my sword at a windmill, trying to write against Cormac McCarthy. So ultimately, I grudging respect to the Faulkner of the borderlands, and I even ripped off one of his stylistic tricks, which I think is a progressive, wonderful thing that he does in his novels. The Border novels, the Border trilogy. He doesn't italicize Spanish.
Well, they don't. In their culture.
Exactly, thank you. Right? Which erases the border between English and Spanish and renders a true kind of border representation of the way languages coexist there. That's a wonderful thing that he did. And I'm sure there was a Chicano writer that did it before him that will forever remain nameless, probably. But he popularized it. And he got New York. I had to kind of fight for that, but by the time I was making the argument, the New York Times was even doing it. So ultimately, I can't talk that bad about Cormac.
Excellent. We have some controversy here tonight. I'd say we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Do you think that there will be, what you were talking about before, the Pueblo being like the commerce for them, you know, the saving, maybe a savior in some ways of those cultures? Do you think that there would then be sort of an interior little bit of, I mean, there's a little bit now, but a civil war in a sense? I mean, like the casino Native Americans kind of saved their people because it poured money into the communities there. But then it sort of got out of control, and now the casino, you know, like an Animal Farm, like the casino Indians are kind of separate now. They're like white men with businesses and stuff. Do you think that there could become enough of a movement towards the respect for those places? You know, could the balance of power?
Well,
You understand
yes,
that?
absolutely. And sure, anything is possible. I mean, I believe that, you know, the miracles can happen. I believe that change can come. You know, it's like one of the. I often I argue a lot with in my own family. We have a lot of different political points of view, and one of the earliest arguments I had with my grandfather in El Salvador during the Civil War was he said, "This is just the way it is. There's rich people and there's poor people, and it's always going to be that way." And I, the young man believing in the revolution, said, "No, we can change this." And guess what? The FMLN is in charge of El Salvador today. The former communist guerrillas, not the death squads or the right-wing Reaganites. So yes, it is. Of course, it's possible. And there's progressive, you know, things that have come out of the casino economy, and there are social costs that have come out of the casino economy. And it's a complicated terrain that is not the purview of this book. I had ambitions to write more about the Pueblo situation. They were our neighbors. We were living within a couple of miles of Okeawinke. But ultimately, right now, the Pueblos don't want to be represented by outsiders, and they put up a wall. And if I was on Okeawinke land and had been dealing with 500 years of violent representations or misrepresentations of my people, I would probably do the same thing. So, but thank you.
Anybody else? Final question.
I just wonder if you have any kind of regional reaction to the book. I grew up here, but I've lived in the East for 30 years. And it was only when I moved to the East I realized how far the West was away. And this is a different West. So I'm just sort of, there's been some shows over the West, and those paintings you were talking about were shown. There was a very controversial show about the tags and things on it. The Native American Museum had its own controversies. They're interesting as citizen Eastern. Hardly, I mean, Manhattan Beach is hardly the West, you know. But I mean, it's closer though. So I was just wondering if you get any different kinds of reactions with your book around different areas.
Well, I mean, we're west of the West here, right? I mean, we're definitely, yeah, like you're saying, it's like Los Angeles is and isn't the West. So, you know, talking about this in LA is different than talking, I was just in New Mexico reading from this, and in Santa Fe, reading before a very well-heeled audience that has its neighbors right next door. These are the neighbors next door, so there it has particular valence. I mean, to read this, I think the West does and can serve as a canvas upon which the country can look at itself. And I think what I'm trying to argue here is that the most recent boom and bust and the terrible price that was paid and we're still paying was at its most radical and violent in the West. Phoenix, San Bernardino, Denver. What happened there in terms of the foreclosure crisis was worse than anywhere else in the country. The unemployment rates were worse than anywhere else in the country. The population growth and the ecological devastation that occurred as a result was worse than anywhere else in the country. So, the way we represent the West from today and here on in, I mean, we saw, you know, I've made the argument, agree with it or not, about, you know, the unholy alliance of real estate speculation and artistic representation early on in the expansion of the West? Well, here we are again today, at another crisis point in the West. How do we represent that today, and what does it mean for the rest of the country? So I think the project of representing the West is crucial to our future as Americans, all of us. And that's why it's called Desert America.
I think that's a great place to end. Let's give Ruben Martinez a warm applause.